Well, welcome to another podcast show of Statecraft in Motion, episode 4. I'm here with again Dr. Shamil he is now actually on holiday, so it's very nice of him to have come on to this show, but he's actually on holidays and he's flying back to Moscow tomorrow. And today's topic, we want to look at, again, we're going to break it up into two parts. One is geopolitical updates, and the other part would be finance, trade, and economics. So the geopolitical scenario at the moment, everyone's talking about what took place in Alaska a couple of weekends ago, and between President Putin and President Trump. And then, of course, following a rather unusual meeting in Washington where the EU leaders all gathered around the Oval Office, around President Trump's table, presumably discussing the outcome of the Alaska meeting. And given how important this meeting is on a global scale, yet the world is no nearer to understanding what transpired between the both men and as well as the meeting in Washington. So what are the issues, Dr. Shamil? What are the issues and factors that have, do you think that have transpired during these discussions? And perhaps what is the talk between amongst the Russian public intelligentsia as to what is the outcome of this whole rather dramatic and yet very much speculated meeting? In fact, one of the things that was being talked about is that there could be a possibility of the unseizing of the 300 odd billion Russian assets being held in Euroclear, and how that can be invested into the US economy in exchange for lifting of sanctions. So this is the talk at the moment. So perhaps you could give us some insights into that.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me again. Yeah, I think that's what really the main outcome, I would say, of the Alaska summit was the first one is that the United States and Russia are back on the negotiation track. I think that's an important thing because there was no any type of contacts taking place between the United States and Russia under the Biden administration, under President Biden. So I think that that's one important outcome is that at least Russia and the United States are now actively basically starting negotiating again. But we're in early stages. I think that's the principal outcome, I would say, of the summit is in Alaska is that there is no more discussion of a ceasefire. I think that before Europeans, the Americans, they were insisting on a ceasefire. They said Russia needs to do, Russia and Ukraine need to agree on a ceasefire. But I think that Russian diplomats have quite successfully persuaded the United States that a ceasefire is not really an option, that there should be a proper peace agreement. Because ceasefire, as you know, previously there was a 30-day ceasefire when first President Trump requested, Russia and Ukraine to get to negotiating table and reach some kind of ceasefire, and that ceasefire was not really working, so it was broken a few times, and that's basically was the principal outcome that there is no more discussion of ceasefire, and. So that's one thing, and I would say that the main outcome is that of this summit is that Russia and the United States agreed to continue discussions. Basically, I don't think any any principal agreements have been reached yet. I think that's, like I said, the principal outcome of this meeting was that there is no more discussion of a ceasefire. So, excuse me. So, because that was not really acceptable to the Russian side. Again, it will be interesting to see what will happen in the next sort of few weeks, because, as you know, President Trump gave 2 weeks to Russia and Ukraine to reach some kind of, move towards more of a track of a kind of peace agreement. Although I think that most people in Russia are quite skeptical about this happening anytime soon. Even international experts suggesting that we're probably looking more at some kind of Christmas time, New Year's time, when there'll be any real steps. I think that's what would be interesting to watch is that, as you know, for President Trump, this meeting in Alaska was obviously quite an achievement for him personally, because he showed that Russians are willing to negotiate with him. And I think that a few things that President Putin reiterated at this meeting is that had Trump in the president, there would not be this military conflict. So that's and another interesting thing is that obviously President Trump, he really wants to become a kind of peacemaker in this conflict, as he suggested he was in other conflicts. So there is discussion of a peace prize, a Nobel Peace Prize for him, and things like that. So I think that's probably an important issue for him as well. Personally, another thing is that what will be interesting to watch, what will happen after there is no real progress in peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, in the next sort of 2 weeks, because that's what President Trump wanted to, the kind of deadline he was suggesting, and then whether that will push the United States towards putting the secondary sanctions on China and India. They've already put sanctions on India, not sanctions, tariffs on India, and potentially more, higher tariffs or sanctions on Russia. So that will be, I would think that would be probably quite an interesting thing to watch, because that could, if we are, going to face this full-scale trade war or tariff war, I think that it will probably create more problems for the global economy.
Yeah,
Taking into account that Russia is a major supplier of oil, and I think that another interesting outcome of this threats towards India and China and Russia is that we're now witnessing the kind of, in some ways, the emergence of the trilateral kind of negotiations between China, Russia, and Ukraine, which is probably going to happen in the next few weeks and few months, because Indians are now actually, because of tariffs that have been imposed on them by the US, even though there are exemptions, there are licenses that the Washington issues for various trade transactions. Still, I think that's it's actually promoting BRICS and promoting other avenues for negotiations between, surprisingly, between China and India, taking into account that they always had historical issues in the past, and Russia could actually play quite an interesting role in that, actually as a promoter of these relationships, improvement of relationships between India and China. So that, I think that's something interesting to watch. In some ways, even Trump criticizes BRICS. He is actually the first president of the United States to actually even mention BRICS, because previous leaders of the US, they basically ignored it. They didn't think it was that important. He has actually, through these tariffs, he is actually promoting links and bringing these countries that were in the past had issues in their relationship, actually bringing them together. This goes back to that, my presentation in Kuala Lumpur in December last year, where I said that actually Trump will be promoting more fragmentation in some ways, and he's actually is promoting fragmentation of traditional relationships, even the relationship between India and the United States, and bringing countries together on platforms that they consider as a stabilizing pillars of support in this current challenging times. So that's actually another interesting thing to that we see as an outcome of this whole a few months of Trump's presidency.
Okay, we will move. I think the topic that the point that you raised, we'll talk about that. It probably a little bit later on what are your expectations on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is due to take place next week. So
Yes.
I think that's quite timely. We'll come to that. But before that, perhaps if you could give us some recap on what the Minsk agreement was all about. And I believe there were some protocols that were set during Istanbul negotiations in early 2022. Now, are those conditions still in place, or are they being superseded by events?
Well, I think that's one of the outcomes of the Minsk agreements is that I mean, just to give you a recap, I mean, there was obviously a series of international treaties that the whole point of them was to end a military conflict in Donbass, which was taking place between people who are closely associating themselves with Russia and those associating themselves with Ukraine. Some people call it more of a kind of internal conflict. Um, and I think that's this obviously happened after there were more discussions about this after the Crimean story, after Russia took control over Crimea, and there is not just one Minsk agreement. There are basically two principal agreements, both named after the capital of Belarus, where these negotiations took place.
Mm-hmm.
The Minsk Protocol, or Minsk One, it was signed in September 2014. This was the initial ceasefire agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a Minsk II agreement, known as just Minsk II, signed in February 2015. And that was basically contained a more detailed and comprehensive kind of set of measures that intended to get implemented in order to stop the fighting there. But unfortunately, despite this initial diplomatic efforts, these agreements failed to stop the fighting, and that basically, what was happening. The good thing about the Minsk II agreement, the main one, is that it was actually endorsed by the United Security Council, and the idea of that was that obviously there would be an immediate or comprehensive ceasefire. There would be withdrawal of heavy weaponry, and there would be monitoring by the OSCE. And there was issue of having local elections. There was the issue of amnesty, release of prisoners, humanitarian assistance, this kind of things. And reinstatement of Ukrainian control over its border. That was probably the most challenging issue for the parties involved. So I think that the key problem of that agreement was that the interpretation, because Ukraine and its Western allies, they actually saw this agreement as a way to integrate Donbas region back into Ukraine with a certain degree of autonomy, but while restoring full control of Ukraine over the territory, including control of the border. And the Russian interpretation was that the Donbas region needs to get proper autonomy, and that it should have a kind of even a veto power over national policy, and holding elections before Ukraine actually regained control. So that was I would say, the principal problem. I mean, one of the things that, for example, Angela Merkel said, the former German chancellor, that Minsk agreement was a way for the West to stop the kind of further escalation and to even rearm Ukraine, for so that it could take control over territories that it is de facto lost. So that was not obviously well received, in Russia, and actually in some ways led to what happened in 2022. So
Yeah, before you go into Istanbul in 2022, there actually something that is for Malaysians this sounds very strange. Can you explain to me why is the Russian language banned in the Ukraine? That's that's one. And number two, um, a lot of the diplomats, the Russian diplomats, often cite this word denazification of Ukraine being one of the conditions of a peace talk. Can you just explain what that means?
I think that in some ways, actually, this was often cited by Russian authorities and Russian experts, is that the issue of the language was becoming a principal issue because after 2014, the removal of Viktor Yanukovych, who was viewed in the West as a pro-Russian president, what happened is that the new leadership of Ukraine, especially at the time, the head of the Ukraine Security Council, Turchinov, he said that he made actually a few statements that I would say created more problems for Ukraine than solved. I mean, one of the things is that he said we're planning to introduce the ban of on the use of Russian language, and we're planning to have a military base in the Black Sea. So in Crimea, and that actually, in some ways, probably was the reaction led to a quite fast decision in Russia to basically start the Crimea operation. And I think that for Ukraine, the issue of the Russian language, especially for the western part of Ukraine, which is, as you know, Ukraine is one of the problems for Ukraine is that it's a country where the western part is more traditionally been oriented more towards the west, especially um, towards the lesser use of a Russian language. Let's put it that way. And the eastern part, territory of Donbas, basically, which is the majority of people, the language that people use is Russian. So that in some ways, probably I would say that the Ukrainian authorities wanted to preserve the kind of cohesion within the country, and they basically realized this one of the ways of doing it actually to promote the Ukrainian language and diminish the use of Russian language. I think that's the first thing. Second thing is that when it comes to the denazification, there were certain groups within Western Ukraine which have basically been promoting a neo-Nazi kind of ideas and things like that. So, and these groups became quite prominent in Ukraine's politics and in Ukraine's military as well. Especially during the Donbas conflict in Donbas, which started really in 2014. So that's probably that's another reason for the Russian authorities active discussion of this issue, because it's for Russian side again. This represents a kind of driving force which creates problems for the Russian population in Donbas.
Mhm.
Okay.
So when you say Nazification or Nazification in the context of uh, Russian-Ukraine relationship, you are specifically referring to a group of people, ethnic groups of people in the Donbas area, and how they're being discriminated against in the in that context? Is
Oh,
that
it's mostly to do with the language, but again, the driving force is of conflict with the Russian speakers. Have been this kind of group of people in the Western Ukraine that have been actively fighting the use of Russian language. And also, one of the suggestions as well was that the Russians or Russian speakers in Ukraine, they should leave Ukraine, basically move to Russia if they want to speak the Russian language.
I see, I see. So that is what they mean by denazification or nazification, whichever side you're on. Because for us in Asia, the word Nazi obviously means it's so specific. You know, it's what happened in Holocaust in Germany during the Holocaust, and that's all we know. So when it's actually applied in the context of Ukraine and Russia, people do get confused here. So I needed you to help us, at least explain the Russian-Ukrainian context in the usage of this specific word. So we move on to Istanbul. In 2022, I believe President Putin was quite specific about his what you call red lines. And then I think he reiterated that last year, July last year, I believe, I think summer of last year, when it was very clear that Russia was already uh, pushing the frontiers, further and further west. And at that time, it was already quite evident that the front lines were already collapsing, although not as fast as people would have thought. Um, Tell us a bit about where where do you think the Russians are in terms of their demands right now? What do you think would bring us closer to seeing an end to this conflict?
Well, I think Russians have requested that Ukraine forces leave these Russian-speaking regions. As you know,
And
in
how far would that be? Would that stretch to Odessa or right up to the nearby?
No, not to Odessa. No, not to Odessa. It's mostly Donbas region, mostly uh, uh, the I would say the southern eastern part of Ukraine. No, I don't have a map, but that's basically the idea is that um, if this happens, basically that would preserve the well-being of Russian speakers in that territory. That's what from the Russian point of view.
Would Russia go further than the Dnieper River?
Again, I think that depends on the progress of negotiations. I think that's taken into account the current efforts um, at negotiations. I think that's we will need to wait and see. But if negotiations fail, and if there are basically Russia in some ways pushed in the corner through sanctions and tariffs and things like that, I think it would continue moving forward. I think that's the way it is because the whole idea, as you know, the goals of this special military operations was that Ukraine is not part of NATO because that's basically there was the principal thing, and the citizens Ukrainian citizens who actually live in the territories of southern eastern Ukraine. A lot of them are now actually becoming Russian citizens. They can actually get a Russian passport. Their Russian language use and the culture are protected. And yes, another purpose is this denazification, something that we already discussed, but I think that's one important thing is that Russia views these groups. They're in Russia viewed as right wing, Western Ukrainians who and I even they even organized you know they're part of this Azov battalion. We probably heard about this, and they're the most active force in Ukraine. So that actually actively promoting the idea of Ukrainian language use. So that's another principal purpose. And that Ukraine does not represent a threat to Russia. You know, that's another aspect of this special military operation. If these conditions are not met, I think that Russia, will continue its efforts, its military efforts.
Mhm. I think I'm just going to mention Article 5 of NATO because this is very important for our audience and what it means and what's its relevance to Russia today. I'm just going to give an overview of Article 5. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty that was signed in 1949 is the cornerstone of NATO's collective defense principle. It establishes that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. This means that if a NATO member is attacked, all other members are obligated to assist the attacked member, which may include the use of armed force. Now, the historical context is the purpose initially was the article was established to provide a security guarantee against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, ensuring that member states would support each other militarily in the event of an aggression. And it's only been once that has happened, the invocation of the Article 5, that was actually September uh, 11 during the where United States was under terrorist attacks, and that led to a collective response from NATO allies. So although Article 5 says that everyone will have to come to the defense of a member that is under attack, and the main purpose of Article 5 was at that time the Soviet Union. But as we all know, Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. So what is this Article 5 in NATO? What is its relevance to Russia?
Well,
Since
I think that um, in terms of relevance, I think that if Russia attacks, a NATO country, then NATO will respond. I think that's the application. I think that this Article 5 has been floated around because some member states. I think that Prime Minister of Italy, Meloni, she I think that suggested that Article 5 should be used in relation to Ukraine, and Ukraine should join NATO, and then it will be protected under Article 5.
Mhm.
But I think that I doubt that this NATO will go for it, because why would they want to invite a country that is actively involved in a military confrontation? I think that's even though I would probably say that Ukrainian leadership would probably welcome that, but I think that not all member states of NATO countries will welcome that idea, because I don't think that they'd want to be actively involved in a military confrontation with Russia.
Mm.
That's basically the context within which Article 5 is being discussed at the moment.
Mhm. Mhm. How how important would you say that you having Ukraine in NATO would be the straw that's going to break the camel's back for Russia?
Well, I think it's already been the straw that broke the camel's back, because I think that Russia, said no, that it doesn't want neighboring countries be part of NATO, because Russia viewed them as a threat,
Mm-hmm.
for security. And we mentioned on our previous discussion that one of the reasons for Russia taking military action in Ukraine was the NATO expansion, because NATO continued to expand despite promises that were made to the Soviet leadership at the time, that especially at the time of German unification, that there will be no NATO expansion to the east.
Yep.
And I think that the point came, and this was the last straw that broke the camel's back, as you put it.
But
You know,
they often argue that there was nothing in black and white. There was nothing concrete. It was mentioned, but it was not decreed.
what do you mean, nothing concrete? In what sense?
It was not a proper agreement. There was not a proper agreement.
Uh, you mean between NATO and the Ukraine? That this kind, those agreements with Gorbachev.
Between
Yeah,
between
Gorbachev, the Soviet leadership.
correct. Between Gorbachev and Reagan at that time.
Hmm. Yes, but at the same time, the NATO expansion, had, even if you rule out those agreements, even they were done verbally, and I think that obviously Russians still say that these agreements were done verbally, and even then, they quote some of these memoirs of some of the leaders, Western leaders involved. But I think that this is not really the principal issue. I think the principal issue there was NATO expansion, which actually came too close to Russian borders. You don't have a buffer zone, so to speak, between NATO and Russia. And Russia always wanted to have these buffer countries that are not members of NATO, that are neutral countries, that don't represent a threat to Russia, especially taking into account the flight time it takes for weapons, rockets to reach, Russia's principal cities,
Yeah.
such as Moscow and St. Petersburg. So this was the issue of expansion actually became quite of a, quite an issue of security for Russia.
Yeah. Yeah. I think people tend to I agree with you. I think the meeting in Alaska is very important because people tend to forget that even when countries are at war, there should be constantly in communication. And that was one of the biggest criticism about this conflict was I believe for about, well, the whole of the 2 years, there was absolutely no communication whatsoever, no discussion whatsoever, no telephone lines, hotlines between Moscow and Berlin or London or Washington, which made the situation very dangerous.
Yes, absolutely, I agree. Yes.
People, you know, tend to forget, oh, just because you're at war doesn't mean you stop talking. In fact, you should be talking even more while you're at war. This is a very standard military, protocol. I just want to move on to next week. The Shanghai SEO that's going to be held in Beijing next week, and I believe President Putin, Prime Minister Modi, and President Xi are all going to be in Beijing doing their probably their photo op with the rest of the global majority. I bet President Trump would love to have been there as well, but I'm sure he won't be. What are the expectations in Russia over the upcoming meeting?
Well, I think that for Russia, these platforms are important in terms of bringing countries together, not sort of separating them. Okay, and I think that's an important issue. I think that for Russia, it's an opportunity to bring India and China closer together as well. I think that's important. But I think there is realization on part of leaders of global majority that the world is changing at a very fast pace. And something that we discussed with you in our previous podcast, that these supplementary alternative platforms are becoming very important, because they when you are living in a fragmented world, you are
Mm,
looking for pillars of support, especially in a world that is becoming more challenging and actually in some ways threatening for countries economically.
mm,
Okay, because if you need to find ways how to secure energy resources, how to secure food supplies, and overall how to promote economic links with countries that you didn't have strong links in the past. You may have had some links, and I think that's one of the things that the amusing thing that's been happening, especially in relations to India, is that a lot of Indian businessmen and some of them involved in the energy sector, they've been actively promoting the idea that India should not really get too close to China and to Russia within those organizations. We should maintain close links with the United States and Europe and the West at large.
mm,
But even these people are now getting burned
mm,
through tariffs, through policies of Trump's presidency. And I think there is a kind of realization on their part that we actually need to start building links with other countries within this new platforms or old platforms that we didn't really view seriously in the past.
yeah.
I think that's we're moving at a very, very fast pace in that respect.
And I think it is also an indication for Russia is that, quite contrary to what the Europeans are saying, Russia is far from being isolated, actually.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Russia, yeah,
Yeah.
Russia is not isolated. Yes,
This meeting in Beijing, I think, is just going to be a very, I mean, it's a stark reminder to the rest of the world, people who are actually just reading legacy media materials, that Russia is not isolated, you know. It is actually going to be at the world stage with the rest of well, even if it's not the Western world, but certainly China and India are very, very big players. And I think we discussed this when I was in Moscow in April, how at that time you did express um, how Russia's finding it difficult to bring two friends together, basically, China and India. And moving forward, I mean, we discussed this in April, and now it's close to September, and how things have changed since April.
yes, yes. I think things will change even more tremendously by next summer. I think we'll see many changes.
What do you foresee next summer?
Well, I think that one of the things I think that we'll probably have the end of the hot stage, I would say, of the military conflicts in Ukraine. I think that one of the problems for Ukrainian army is that they're running out of men and weapons. I think that's weapons they probably may be able to still secure, but I think that the fact that they're running out of men would create issues for them.
Yeah,
And I think that's one thing. But potentially we could have a kind of a peace agreement even end of hostilities within the next sort of three to 6 months, even sooner. So it's just I think that's one important aspect as well. When it comes to Russia's isolation, I think that's it managed to pivot to the east, so to speak, as we mentioned. And I think that's some policymakers in the US, especially Senators Graham and Blumenthal, they're suggesting that we need to pass bone crushing sanctions and bone
Bone
crushing tariffs.
crushing, yeah, bone crushing.
Yeah, but the problem is that if they introduce these bone crushing tariffs against China and India, I think that
It's
they
gonna,
will speed up the disintegration of the old system and the emergence of the new one. I think that's what they'll have. And that's the first. That will be the medium term outcome. But the short term outcome, will be that we will probably have a global economic crisis.
mm,
Taking into account that the state of Western economies is not that great, especially in Europe.
yeah. Well, eh, I think it's a good time to move into our part two, on the economic side. Uh, I attended a forum last week, and basically we were talking about, of course, everyone's talking about Trump tariffs, and the week before, U.S. and China actually extended their trade truce for another 90 days. So Donald Trump actually signed an executive order to keep pause in place until November 10th, while Beijing also announced an extension. So, which means that US still hold a levy of 30% on Chinese imports, while China will keep a 10% tariff on American goods. And when I attended the forum last week, and someone mentions that actually basically everybody else in the world capitulated. I mean, they all gave in, right? Because we've
Yes.
been so used to just trading with US. It's just so easy because the market's been there for so long, and then everything is there, and now everyone's scrambling, so they need time. So everyone could capitulated except for China, right? Uh, so where eh, do you think that Trump tariffs are working or not in general?
Well, I think that it depends on specific country. I would say. I
Mm,
think that's when it comes to, for example, India. They also introduced tariffs against India. And Brazil, and they actually, in some ways, promoting, like I said, this closer links between new partners, let's say, or old partners that they were good partners maybe in the past, but now they're building more economic links. That's the first thing. I think with China, the United States cannot really take on China for a number of reasons, because it's still it takes occupies still quite a significant part, production as producing base for the United States, for the US economy, and the rare earth minerals as well. Because if China stops rare earth mineral supplies, I think that will quite badly damage the United States. I think that's probably the reason why the US is not really keen on putting tariffs on China, because even though Trump made this announcement initially that he wants to put tariffs on China, I don't think that he's actually able to do that,
you think that after the
because
90,
it will backfire really badly against the United States.
so we might even
And
see.
China knows it. I think China knows it, and also China. I think what the Chinese have been doing as well. They've been building new economic links with other countries as well, and they've been actively doing that. Even within the Asia Pacific region as well. Not on a global scale, because China has been active in Africa and Latin America and things, and places like that. But it's we're seeing tremendous changes in that respect as well.
Mm. So basically, by your argument, you just see this 90 days rolling continuously.
Yes, or another possibility is that United States declares tariffs, but then will give exemptions, which are not made public.
Yeah,
That's another possibility.
yeah. Especially on computer chips and
And a
certain.
lot of things, I think that because the United States, it cannot secure rare earth minerals from other sources at the moment.
Yeah.
It will take a few years, maybe never.
Hmm. I recently the And coming back to the Russian economy and how not isolated it is. And I believe your governor recently lowered interest rates in the banking system. How now? What does that tell you about the Russian economy?
Yeah, actually, I've been reading just over the past few days reports in the Western media that the Russian economy is not in great shape and it's about to collapse and things like that. But I've been reading these reports since
Yeah,
2022.
correct.
I think that if you look at the real figures, the economy has actually performed surprisingly well, especially if you look at purchasing power parity based GDP, which is now ranking fourth global. The budget deficit, even though it's growing, um, uh, it actually remains low compared to other G7 countries. And sanctions actually force positive shifts towards supporting domestic producers. Now, something I mentioned as well in our previous podcast, that we're seeing companies are focusing on developing their own capabilities within Russia, and also a lot of people are now consuming Russian products.
Yeah,
So that um, I think that's growth obviously been slow for example, in 2024 due to the high base effects of previous years. But I think for Russia, the important thing is that it will be not so much further growth, but the quality of this growth, what actually makes that growth possible. Because what we're seeing, for example, in over the past few months in countries such as Spain, again, if you read the Financial Times, Bloomberg, they're suggesting that Europe is back on track, it's recovering, things like that. But that's actually basically been done mostly through government spending.
yeah,
Okay, and the key issue now in the next few months and years, I think I would say 2 3 years, would be how this growth is generated in Russia. Because the important thing is that a lot of now experts are suggesting that this growth should be driven by innovation
mm,
through IT, fintech, artificial intelligence, digitalization, these kind of things. And because I think that in some ways this model of relying on oil and gas, even though it may be contributing to Russian economic stability, but at the same time, the important thing is that Russia should actively move into other areas. That's the important
yeah.
thing.
Because we often hear that the reason why, even when the media looks at the stats from Russia, they'll always say, "Oh, that's because the Russian economy is overheating because it's a war economy." They always say that. And
Mhm.
secondly, there's so much dependency on oil that if we keep the prices of oil really low, or we crash the oil prices, then the whole thing would, the whole thing would collapse. So what you're saying is that there has been a lot of effort to diversify the Russian economy. How successful do you think that has been?
Well, I think we're in early stages. I think one important thing is about, just in relation to your comment about crushing the Russian economy. I think it's quite a strange thing to do in some ways, things which are quite contradictory. I mean, one thing is that Europe imposes, this oil price cap on Russian supplies. At the same time, it tries basically to limit Russian supplies of oil. And if you are limiting supplies of oil from a country, prices go up.
Yep.
I mean, this is Russia. Russia is a major producer. And one of the things that, for example, Indians are saying is that we're buying Russian oil, but we're buying it because we're stabilizing global oil market. And they're actually absolutely right in that respect. So that's the important thing to keep in mind. And I think that for Russia now, the key issue is how I mean, one of the things that actually drives innovation in Russia, or will be driving innovation in Russia, is the lack of labor shortages. Something that I think also mentioned in our previous discussion is that there will be drive, and we see early kind of stages of that. Um, the use of automation and robotization, the use of AI-powered industrial robots to solve labor shortages. Basically, that's in order to increase, productivity. So that's one thing. Another important thing for Russia, I think, is to drive to develop logistics. Northern Sea Route, North-South corridor. This also, very important for Russia, to become quite a prominent economy
Yeah,
in the world that is emerging.
correct.
That's another important aspect to keep in mind.
I think so. I think we're going to probably have to devote um, a podcast on new trade routes because that is actually challenging the traditional maritime powers that has dominated the seas for the last 600 years. And
Yes,
someone,
yes,
yeah, and for a country like Malaysia that has the Straits of Malacca, can you imagine how that's going to impact us? You know, is there going to be enough expanding trade and global GDP to be able to say if there's going to be any diversions of trade routes, will it affect the maritime countries like ourselves? Straits of Malacca is very important. I mean, 60% of the trade in global trade goes through our sea here. So that would be interesting to devote a at least a podcast or so on it.
yes, because there are lots of issues in relation to new trade routes. These discussions between Azerbaijan and Armenia, the so-called Trump corridor.
Uh,
You know, the,
Zangezur corridor.
yes, the new trade route. So there is a lot of quite a lot to discuss in that respect. So a lot of things are happening.
Not even moved over to the Middle East and all that
Yes,
areas yet.
yeah.
Which we will, we will discover all these things together. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Shamil. This is going to be a short podcast, but all of us on holiday, so I will let you go back to your family so that you can enjoy the rest of your holidays. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Nice talking to you. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a
Bye.
good day.
Hi, everyone. We've come to the post analysis of our fourth podcast entitled Turning Point and Not End Point for the Alaska summit between Trump and Putin that took place last month. So, in this podcast, the meeting was focused, of course, on the geopolitical updates between President Putin and President Trump. And I get the sense from Dr. Shamil that he noted that President Trump's efforts to mediate the conflict could lead to some sort of tensions in China. But I think from a Russian viewpoint, they seem very optimistic that the summit in Alaska, at least it's no longer a closed door uh, uh, um, eh, relationship, meaning that it is now it provides an indication, or at least it smooths the pathway to further negotiations, because this is going to take a while. It's not going to be the end of the war in 24 hours, as President Trump promised during his campaign. So I get the sense that the Russians are very pleased that um, US sees Russia as a formidable partner, someone that is a country that is respected, especially when Trump indicated that he was open, that it was a good meeting, although there were not a lot of details. At least, according to Shamil, a good indication was he had stopped talking about ceasefire, because a ceasefire, as far as President Putin is concerned, is not negotiable, simply because they do not believe that ceasefires are sincere. And in the past, ceasefires have always been used as a way to buy time to build up military strength, and it's something that they would not want repeated. And we went on to discuss the Minsk agreements, and how the Minsk agreement has been interpreted. And I think the Europeans have their version of what took place and their understanding of it, and the Russian also have their version on how they see the Minsk agreement and what the pitfalls were, and they would really want to avoid those pitfalls. Basically, Shamil was saying that they viewed the agreements as Russia's desire to bring back the Donbass region. And we also covered, we had a conversation about what Russia's perspectives are on denazification of Ukraine, where he clarified that there are a lot of concerns about the use of the Russian language amongst Russian peoples on the eastern part of Ukraine. And their their entry into the conflict with Ukraine is justified because they were there to protect the rights of their people. So I think I also get the sense that the military goals that were set out in 2022 by Russia is coming to an end, meaning that I think the war is going to be decided on the battlefield, and it's not going to be decided by way of negotiation. And if if I read the conversation correctly with Dr. Shamil, is that they feel that the Trump administration understands that as well, quite clearly. So we also talked a little bit about the Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. So we went into a bit of the historical context and the relevance to Russia today. Again, I think the red lines have not shifted and remains the same, that Ukraine must not join NATO. I think in this episode too, we also covered, and by way of the fact that Russia is a lot more confident on the battlefield now, it has more time to then seek global engagement, and that would be their strategy in the SCO. And we have already seen that President Modi, sorry, I beg your pardon, Prime Minister Modi, President Putin, and President Xi were all in Beijing a couple of weeks ago. And I think, again, the message that Russia wants to send out to the world, that it's not isolated. In fact, it is able to even bring the dragon and the elephant together in one room to sort out what he calls the bigger picture, and see and to see to look at economic links between India and China, and of course with Russia, in spite of all the pressures from the US. So I also get the sense that in the conversation with Dr. Shamil, that Russian people are also feeling a lot more a lot more resilient about what's happening in their own country, that their food security is being assured, and people are going about their own lives, and they in fact see improvement in the last 2 years, despite the SMO. And to some extent, the Dr. Sharma was trying um, to show, I think, our audience is that Russia is economy, despite all the Western media, um, it's actually thriving. Yeah. Particularly when it's measured against purchasing power parity and GDP. And he, in fact, reckons that the sanctions have led to positive shifts, um, especially when it comes to supporting domestic producers, companies, and they have actually really turned their attention to building up a lot of the internal capacity, especially in areas like fintech, artificial intelligence, and digitalization, education, um, of course, military, airspace, space technology, and things like this. So I think the fact that there's going to be also, he hinted at that time there are going to be new trade routes opening. And I think in future episodes we're going to cover those a lot more. The North Atlantic route, and of course, we've also seen that China has just signed a new pipeline deal called the Power of Siberia 2 with Russia. And that would assure Russia's sale of LNG for the next 30 years, I believe. So we're going to cover that in our next episode. And that would be an interesting topic to get our insights from Dr. Shamil. So we're looking forward to that, and I hope you have enjoyed our show very much. So see you next time. Thank you.